Hello, welcome to my channel. This is perspective number 3 of a series of videos that I'm making. And today I'm sitting down with a friend, Keegan. He's an undergraduate in computer science and business technology. Is that right?
That's right.
All right, so I'm making these series of videos as a perspective of the universe using information as the most fundamental aspect of the universe and all the other forces of nature, including quantum fields and space-time, which is gravity, emerges from that framework. And it's interesting to make and explain this concept in a series of videos as a bunch of different perspectives because different perspectives of this information is the mechanism that makes these different forces emerge. So explaining it in this way not only gives you a sense of the mechanism, but also is the mechanism working itself out in reality. So if I get as many different perspectives, the first perspective was my perspective, the second perspective was with a family therapist, now I'm doing it with an undergraduate student. If I keep on compiling these different perspectives, hopefully it will resonate with more and more people and will enhance the understanding we have of how the universe works and the best theory possible. However, I would like to mention that science really doesn't explain reality, it's just the closest theory or hypothesis that we have of reality, and doing things like this and talking about it will enhance everyone's understanding and hopefully lead to new perspectives that explain reality and different parts of it at different scales. So on this first slide, we just have the most simple form of information is binary information. And that's just a code for the pattern of information that exists at all these different scales. It doesn't mean that zeros and ones are the basic form of information at the most fundamental part of reality. It just means that this is a placeholder for either energy or matter is there or not there, or maybe a wave is there or not there. It's just a placeholder for the patterns that form. And the different ways that these patterns can come together, you can think of it as kind of shining two lights at a wall in a way, and the different perspectives that you use shining those lights at a wall, whether you're close or far from it, will enhance the intensity of light depending on where you aim those two lights. So you can think about that as the two lights are almost the different perspectives you can take at this information, and those two lights or the stereoscopic channels, and the different perspectives create disparity. So the different where you put the light either increases or decreases the intensity, which is going to create different connections and different geometry and depth. That geometry is what space-time is, and space-time creates gravity. Matter collects in this gravity, and it not only collects in galaxies and solar systems, but it also collects in organic matter like life on Earth. And this can all be thought of in a fractal framework because at all different scales, whether it be small or huge, as big as the universe, it's the same organizing informational mechanism that's working. And we'll talk about this more in the upcoming slides. So Keegan, do you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, I have probably a few questions. I feel like as a undergraduate, I would have just like not too unique of a perspective, but more of like teetering on the line of quite understanding this. So I think my questions will be more in line of like how could this really relate to us, something that the normal person can understand. And my first question would be, is there any better word for it than information when it comes to like the most fundamental thing?
So the better words for it, I think, would be energy or matter, or what's the most basic form of energy that we've measured, or wave functions or quantum waves. So you can also think about it as quantum waves, ha- quantum waves on a, a quantum field, which is just an excitation. A particle is basically just an excitation on that quantum field. However, you can just think of that excitation as being a one, and then if the excitation isn't there, it would be at zero. So it's just
Mm,
a placeholder for it. And we'll talk about how this binary information, it can actually be a perfect metaphor for how quantum mechanisms emerge and how superposition and entanglement occur.
mm,
So don't think about this as really being what the fundamental aspect of reality is. You can just think about it as the best way that we can think about the
mm,
most fundamental patterns.
mm. Okay.
All right, so moving on. Do you have another
Mm,
question for this
I
one?
think no, that's it
All
for
right.
that one.
So let's get to physics and the two different views in the history of physics. So you had classical physics and quantum physics. So quantum physics was figured out about 100 years ago by people like Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, and Albert Einstein. And quantum physics explains things from a discrete perspective, meaning that everything is quantized or broken down in the smallest bits and particles, and you're trying to understand how the basic particles mix together and interact with one another. So classical physics explains things like how the planets orbit the sun, and it's quite easy to understand the cause and effect relationships that occur because it's a continuous framework that we observe. So it has a direct connection to our senses because we can see how a ball flies through the air. We can also see, if we use a telescope or just look at the moon, we can understand how orbits happen. However, we can't simply observe how electrons or photons become entangled and how they interact with each other. But one way you can think about how these two things are connected is that all of these discrete quantum particles, the way they interact with each other and become entangled, end up having emergent continuous geometry that we see on the classical level. And a great quote by Werner Heisenberg is, not only is the universe stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. And the reason why I think it's stranger than we can imagine is because even though our brain is built with quantum particles like electrons, our consciousness evolved to understand things at bigger scales, like a ball or a spear or something flying through the air. It didn't evolve to understand how photons move through space because that's not very important for our way of life. So our senses exist in the classical scales. However, they are made up of fundamental particles like quantum particles in a quantum field. So, do we have any questions from Keegan?
Hmm. So you said it took about 100 years for us, like from now back then, for them to figure out this model of quantum physics.
Right, the early
Mm.
1900s.
Okay. And it took like thousands, millions of people thinking about it, like
Correct.
to get to
Right.
this point.
So,
That's
in that, just thinking about it through that way, you can understand how it takes a lot of different perspectives combining together. So, just how classical physics evolved into quantum physics by a lot of different scientists combining their perspectives together, that in itself is this mechanism happening. And that's what I'm trying to do with these videos, is to get these ideas out there so we can explain how things like gravity and quantum mechanics might emerge from more fundamental frameworks. And as that perspective is shared and more perspectives are added, hopefully we can get a more and more accurate way of learning this perspective so that we can come up with new ideas that can resonate with everyone and help us in many more ways of life than just things like how to come up with a quantum computer or how to come up with a GPS system or how to measure gravitational waves for a black hole. The more we share these perspectives, the more we can bring them down to earth and use them in things like family therapy and help to understand other people's perspectives just in your friend or family relationships. Anything
Yeah,
else to add, Keegan?
yeah. It would be real interesting if everybody could understand that right side. Do you see that as realistic one day, maybe?
I do think that everyone will eventually start to understand the quantum aspect of things, entanglement and superposition, and that's what I'm going to try to do in the next two slides.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to understand the quantum aspect of things because it will help you understand other people's perspective and why people think so differently. And it comes down to how the information is processed at the most fundamental level, which we'll get into.
All right.
So we're good on this one?
Yeah.
So now let's break it down to wave mechanics and explain classical versus quantum. And I took out probabilities in my previous videos. I had classical probabilities and quantum probabilities. However, they aren't perfectly broken up like that because quantum still starts under classical right here. So I kind of oversimplified it in my previous videos. However, in this one, I'm trying to explain it more accurately. But the same story still remains. And I got this image from a book called The Cosmic Code, which I'll reference at the end of this video. So the classical way of thinking about wave mechanics is you simply add the two waves. So the two waves are already known. Then that gives you a new wave. And if you want to understand the intensity of that wave, you can square the wave one added to wave two. However, quantum physics works a little bit different, where you start off squaring wave one and two. And the reason why you do that is because you have to understand all the possible ways that wave one could have happened. So it's not that wave one was already known, like in classical mechanics. It's that you have to account for all the possibilities, which is in wave one squared. And you can think of the possibilities as I'll reference the double slit experiment. Does it go through the left slit or the right slit? Or does it go through a combination of both? So this is a way of understanding the probability that it could go through both. So you square wave one and wave two. That gives you wave one squared and wave two squared. And after that, you can add wave one squared and wave two squared, and that will account for all the possible paths, wave one and wave two, which will give you the sum of squares. And the sum of squares is not equal to the square of sums from classical mechanics. And this is why quantum mechanics is different from classical mechanics, because it uses the intensity of the wave to account for all the different possibilities that could have occurred. So you can think of all the summing over all the possibilities or the sum of the squares as being the superposition or the entanglement of all the possibilities of the waves. So this slide is a little bit more complicated to understand, when it comes to superposition, but it does show you the two difference between classical and quantum mechanics. However, the next slide, I think, explains superposition a little bit better. So anything to add on this slide?
No, I don't think so. This one's definitely still a bit confusing to me, even after seeing it a few times. But I guess so. A peak, like in the wave, a peak would be considered the one. At the bottom of the wave would be considered a zero. Is that right? Like existence or not being there, or is that?
You can kind of think about it like that. I think the next slide, when you break it down to stereoscopic channels,
Mm-hmm.
where wave one and wave two, you can think of wave one squared being a stereoscopic channel, wave two squared being a stereoscopic channel. So you could think of it as each peak is would be black, or each trough is white, or vice versa. You can think of it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then whenever you superimpose those and you have a superposition, then you end up with a sum of squares. You can think about it like that.
Okay.
So let's move to the next slide, which I was just referring to. So you can think of two stereoscopic channels, a left channel and a right channel. And whenever you superimpose or put these on top or combine these two images, you end up with an image or a picture that looks three-dimensional. So the superimposed image would be the superposition or entanglement of the left and right channel. Or you can think of this, the left channel as wave one and the right channel as wave two. And then the superimposed image is when you add both of these squared waves together. And this is a perfect way of explaining, as a metaphor, superposition or entanglement, because a lot of hypothesis right now are asking the question, how does information move faster than the speed of light when you can have two entangled particles like the left and right channel, and you can spread these particles away from each other, and when you change one, it simultaneously changes the correlation of the other. So how is information moving faster than the speed of light? But I think what's happening here is it's not really information is moving faster. It's just that the superimposed image created by both particles combined will change if you change a certain portion of this image or particle. So it's not really information moving, it's just the correlation is changing. So any questions or concerns?
So you said the speed of information changing. No, that's you. Is it actually possible to measure like the speed at which information travels?
So the experiments that have tried to measure this, and they've been all kind of new hypotheses trying to figure this out, even that there's wormholes that exist in between both particles that can transfer information faster than light. However, I think that that is a framework in physics that's working itself out, but I don't think that's gonna lead to reality or the best way for us to think about it as humans. I
Mm-hmm.
think the best way to think about it is that you can think of entanglement as almost like the memory a particle has from its past interactions.
Mm-hmm.
So while the left particle and the right particle right now, they share a perfect correlation, which makes a superimposed image. When they come in contact with other particles, that memory gets changed a little bit. So then that will change the superimposed image that occurs. So you can think of all the particles in the universe existing like this, And you can think of the superimposed image as almost the memory that every particle has with one another. And you can make two particles entangled and separate them on opposite sides of the universe, and they'll still correlate to make the image that's superimposed. But then when you interact with the particle, that destroys some of the entanglement, which will end up changing the correlate how these left and right particles are correlated, and it changes the correlation. So it changes, in this case, the metaphor we're using is the superimposed image. And if you want to read this right here, it also explains what I'm trying to explain, that observing the 3D object doesn't violate local causality. Similarly, quantum non-locality means that reality is woven together by deep structural cross-correlations that transcend individual localized objects. So that's just talking about that you can have two particles on opposite sides of the universe, and if they're entangled, they will have a correlation with each other that can kind of be thought of as a superimposed image like this. But as they come into contact with other particles, then that correlation diminishes, yet still remains as part of that particle. Any concerns or
Hmm.
cares?
I don't know.
Alrighty. So this is the best analogy, and again, it's from the book by Heinz Pagels, The Cosmic Code. So if you want to, the whole book goes over all of physics. If you want to read more about that, I highly suggest that book, or you can just look up how stereoscopic channels can be used to understand quantum superposition. And I think this can also be used to understand human interactions, because whenever two people interact with each other, you can think of their perspectives are combining kind of like a superimposed image. So it's not like one person's perspective is going to directly add to the other person. It's really going to be a mix of that person's perspective adding to the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a human way to think about it. And after all, our brain is made up of a lot of different quantum particles mixed together. So let's move on to how nature creates new realities, from simple information to the fabric of the universe. So this is kind of an overview of what we just went through on the two previous slides. You can think of it as binary information, which information is just the fundamental raw material. It's not zeros and ones. It's just, it represents the patterns at the most fundamental layer of reality. And at the most fundamental layer of reality, you have different perspectives of the underlying data, and different perspectives will create new emergent patterns. And how those new emergent patterns will create different ways to connect to the underlying information. So it will continually make new geometry, and new geometry will continually emerge. And that geometry is what we call space time, and space time is gravity. Space time is what matter and energy flows through and what gives it direction, and that's what we call gravity. So any cares or concerns?
Hmm. How long has gravity not been considered a force? I guess I've always, yeah, always thought of it as a force pulling us down to Earth. But how is it different?
So in the early 1900s, Albert Einstein came up with the theory of general relativity. And he came up with it really using his imagination, thinking about falling in the air And whenever you're falling, you don't really feel any force acting on you. You just feel weightless, almost like you're in space. So there's really not any force acting on you. It's just that you're moving with the geometry of space. So you can think of space being bent towards Earth. So it's actually just the geometry of space time. It's not really a force acting on you. Like Newton, when Newtonian gravity explained it as a force of attraction, but then Einstein came in 100 years ago and explained it as space-time in the theory of general relativity, and explained it as just the fabric of space. And that fabric of space is what matter and energy flow through, kind of like a fluid. So I would say for a little over 100 years, it's been thought of as a fabric of space and time, instead of a force of gravity. And we'll explain how time is incorporated into this fabric in future slides. So does that give you a better grasp of how gravity isn't really a force and how it emerges from these connections?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like the images also help with like that net like looking like mesh like texture. Kind of gives the idea of a bowl, I suppose,
Right,
and things fall to the bottom of a bowl, like you're saying,
right.
like with gravity.
So yeah, you can think of the connection between all these zeros and ones in different perspectives. As they connect, they create geometrical patterns. Those geometrical patterns create the fabric of reality. Things like the sun and the earth bend that fabric of reality even more. And then as this fabric of reality bends, it causes other things to fall into that geometry as you're describing.
Okay.
So that is a good way to think about it. So you ready to move on?
Yep.
So now let's switch gears a little bit and move from gravity to quantum fluctuations for a second. So quantum fluctuations were predicted by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and they've also been measured by the Casimir effect. So you can have two plates in a vacuum, and you can measure a force between the two plates, and since it's in a vacuum, we can hypothesize that quantum fluctuations must be occurring. And the way that you can think about these quantum fluctuations as different geometry trying to connect together as this information is emerging new geometry, which enables it to have new perspectives and connect in different ways. So you can think of these quantum fluctuations as the fundamental information of reality, always trying to connect in new ways. And it's not only been predicted by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, it's been measured, but a easy way to think about it is that it's just a way that the information is all connected in the universe, and it's always trying to find new ways to connect as new things emerge. So any cares or concerns from Keegan?
I don't think I got anything for this one.
All right, and you can think about these quantum fluctuations as being the fabric of electromagnetic or electron or quark fields,
Mhm.
and that the particles in these fields are just the peaks of the waves, and everything in between those peaks aren't really empty space. There's no such thing as empty space. You just have quantum fluctuations.
Hmm.
So let's move on to those waves that I just mentioned and why quantum mechanics uses wave. It uses waves because reality is relational. It's not separate. Everything is connected. So at the most fundamental level, nature does not deal in isolated particles. It deals with relationships, possibilities, and interference. So you can think of interference as just waves in the ocean. The way waves in the ocean make bigger waves is by smaller waves combining together. So they're interfering with each other. And that's why at the most fundamental, one of the most fundamental aspects of reality, which are quantum fields, those quantum fields have waves moving through them, and the way that they combine with other quantum fields is by interference, because that lets all of the information to be integrated into new patterns. So waves are good to use because it's a way that everything can connect and integrate together. That's a simple way to look at it.
Hmm.
Any cares or concerns?
What's something other than water that you would like that just anybody would be able to visualize these waves as?
So one of the newest things, and we'll talk about it in future slides, is you can even think of it as gravitational waves. So we've measured gravitational waves. So even in empty space, you can have waves moving through empty space. For instance, when two neutron stars collide to create a black hole, it's going to release gravitational waves even through the vacuum of space. So you can think of it as it's creating waves through these quantum fluctuations, which also shows that everything is connected in kind of a sea of fluctuations that exists even in the vacuum of space. So there's no such thing really as nothing.
Mm.
You can think of the vacuum of space as still being the cosmic ocean of quantum fluctuations, or information always reorganizing, just like water molecules reorganizing in the sea even when it's perfectly still.
And so, do a lot of these waves just, I mean, I wouldn't say emerge, I would say not emerge from nothing, but where would these waves come from?
So that's
And,
why I think thinking about it through different perspectives of information is the best way to understand where these waves come from. Because no matter what type of field you're talking about, whether it be electromagnetic field or the quark field, the underlying aspect connecting all these fields together is information, because all
mm,
particles or waves carry some sort of information. Therefore, that is the underlying code connecting everything in reality is information. And I use zeros and ones just because that's the simplest way to
mm,
designate this information.
yeah. All right.
So waves are useful because of interference. That's basically the take home of this slide.
Mm,
So whenever you have all these different fields and all these fluctuations constantly trying to find new configurations and ways for this information to emerge, you'll end up with an exploration of possibilities that creates a network of existence. So a way you can think about it is there's many different outcomes that may have occurred. However, we are constrained to some of the things that happened in the past. For instance, stars were created early in the universe before planets were created. Those stars created bigger elements, and those bigger elements combined into molecules on planets, and those molecules combined into condensates and cells and organelles to make life on planets. So we are stuck with being made out of molecules and atoms and cells. We have we're stuck with that because that choice has been made previously in the universe. However, there are many different possibilities that could occur in the future that we aren't constrained by. So we constantly have this emergent pattern of possibilities that we find ourselves in. So, any cares or concerns?
Yeah, I feel like anybody would think like this is the multiverse, as it says, multiverse possibilities. But is there actually any way to like observe the other outcomes that could have been?
So, I think there's a lot of different theories of the multiverse, but I think where the multiverse really lies is the realm of possibilities that could have occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And in our universe, I think that those possibilities have been determined, but possibly if you go beyond the observable universe, maybe there's universes that evolved in a different way because they're on a different trajectory or a different branch than we're on. And in those different branches of the universe, I think that things could have evolved differently. Maybe atoms don't need to exist and there's something else that could exist and accumulate and form something that looks like life. But I don't think that some multiverse theories explain that almost like at every choice we make, there's a whole nother universe that splits off and it's the same exact universe as this one, except we made a different decision or something. I don't
Yeah.
really think that really fits because I think there's a lack of cause and effect relationship. However, I do think there is a multiverse of possibilities and that beyond our universe could exist many different universes that are still part of our universe in some network, however, could have slightly different physical constraints because they're on a different evolutionary or emergent trajectory. So, in that sense, I do think the multiverse could exist, but it still has a cause and effect relationship. It's not that a new universe pops into existence every time any of us make a decision or something and there's
Mm-hmm.
another universe where we didn't make that decision or something like that.
Hmm.
Any other cares or concerns for this one?
Would that mean that every universe that is a possibility of existing would have already existed, or or you say like every time we make a decision, a new universe is created? Obviously, it's not, but
That's what I
mm-hmm.
was saying current
Mm-hmm.
multiverse theories might say,
Mm-hmm.
but I would say that every possibility could happen. However, we're stuck with explaining this one.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's move on to how exactly do all these bits of information combine together to create atoms, to create molecules? What's the best theory to explain how all of this works? How does it create galaxies and superclusters of galaxies? How does it create biomolecular condensates, which are just groups of biological information? So, how does this all happen? And the best theory that you can find at every different scale that I just talked about is called percolation theory. So, how possibility becomes reality. So, you have these new geometrical configurations that are emerging, and you have quantum fluctuations that's trying to connect them in new ways and constantly finding new perspectives. And as new perspectives are found and more connections are made, you continuously have new emerging geometry. And the easiest way to visualize this or come up with a metaphor to explain it could be bubbles percolating in a coffee pot. At first, you have a few bubbles spread out. As more bubbles percolate, they combine together until there's a whole system of bubbles. Or you can think of it as a forest fire. You have a few different spots in the forest that got struck by lightning and created a fire. And as that fire spreads out and connects, eventually you have a whole part of the forest, or maybe the whole forest, that's on fire. And this is just explaining how you can get to basic information, making connections, and as more connections are made, you have geometry that emerges, and that geometry allows for more connections, which subsequently creates more emergent geometry. And you can think of this way that information organizes itself at all scales from a sigmoidal curve. So there's simple mathematics that can explain how this information organizes together. And a sigmoidal curve and percolation theory can be used to explain how some quantum phenomena percolate. It can be used to explain how biomolecular condensates through liquid-liquid phase separation organizes in life on Earth. And it can be used to understand how galaxies and superclusters of galaxies form the cosmic web. So it's the same mechanism organizing everything at different scales. And the way that it happens is something called criticality. So you have a point right here, which is a point of criticality, which separates chaos to the left and order to the right. And you can think of percolation happening to the right. So to the left, you have things grouping up and building up, like in the sense of biology, you have a bunch of biomolecules starting to combine, starting to come together. And then eventually you have enough biomolecules that come together that it builds a whole system that separates itself and creates boundary conditions through something called liquid-liquid phase separation. So this is one way that biology comes together, and I think it's the most fundamental way, but it can be used to explain anything. It can be used to understand how asteroids through accretion comes together. At first, you just have a few asteroids randomly coming together, and then a few of those smaller groups come together until you cross a critical threshold that creates a bigger bin in space-time, so it creates more gravity, and then it just starts sucking up all kind of littler asteroids until you have a planet that evolves. So the example of biomolecular condensates through liquid-liquid phase separation or the accretion of asteroids to create planets, both can use this point of criticality and the sigmoidal curve, simple math, to explain how information is organized at vastly different scales.
Can this be used to explain like the Big Bang Theory?
So the Big Bang Theory is an interesting question, and I think most scientists who think about the Big Bang Theory don't think about it as the start of everything. It's just the furthest that we've been able to think about. So maybe you could think about it as what was before the Big Bang. Maybe there was some form of existence before the Big Bang, maybe a black hole in another universe, and that black hole reached a critical point and then eventually percolated into a new universe.
Hmm.
So you can think about it like that. However, I think that's still in the totally theoretical parts of science.
Mm,
However, this framework, like I said, can be used to think about how information is organized at every scale, not
mm.
not only biological small scales, but also huge scales like planets forming, solar systems forming, galaxies, galaxy superclusters, and even the whole universe forming
Hmm.
and the cosmic web.
Okay.
So this simple math echoes at all the different scales. And that's shown on this slide, that the way that this information is organized together can not only give a framework for understanding black holes, but it can give you a framework for understanding stars and planets and life on other planets and galaxy clusters, because it's the same geometry that's percolating from these different connections, finding different possible paths based off the information, based off the underlying information. So any cares or concerns on this slide?
Hmm.
So this is really showing that gravity really isn't a force, it's just the geometry of existence, of even time.
So gravity and time, they aren't fundamental, they're emergent. That's what you're saying?
Right, and that kind of
Cool.
brings us to our next few
Hmm.
slides, which we'll get into more. So we can just go to it right now and eventually get to it. So how is this time created? And this will be the next like 3 slides talking about time. So I'll explain it from a human and a physics perspective. So you can have Hilbert space, which is the space of all possible quantum possibilities. And you can also think about that as our imagination. And then when you have entanglement between two particles, that's when the possibilities are determined, which creates geometry. But in a human perspective, you can think of the possibilities as imagination, and your consciousness tries to make connections with your imagination and with what you've observed in reality. And sometimes, if you do that, if you continue to do that, you'll come up with new innovations and new ideas which you can implement into reality. So, any cares or concerns?
Hmm. I do like how you compared them to the human brain, imagination and consciousness, and then reality. I feel like that laying it out like that is a really big help for sure.
And that moves us right along to our next slide about how everything's connected through gravitational waves. Because if your consciousness does have an imagination that's connected to reality, then somehow we must be able to think of different things in reality. So, how does our brain comprehend a galaxy far, far away? And it's because what I talked about previously, it follows the same organizational principles. So, the same way that your brain can organize a galaxy or a holographic image of a galaxy in your brain, the same physical constraints are organizing a huge galaxy in reality. So, since the same physical constraints and organizing informational networks are working, that's why we can experience a holographic representation of anything that exists outside of our body. It's because everything is connected in this informational fabric. And one way that we've learned that everything is connected in this way is something called laser interferometers, like LIGO. And this LIGO detection center, one of them is actually in Louisiana, where we're making this video. And what LIGO can do is measure gravitational waves. So whenever a black hole is formed, It produces gravitational waves, which is a wave through the fabric of information that connects everything. And we can detect this at detection centers like LIGO. So this is just one way that we've learned how everything is connected.
And this connection, it's found all throughout the universe, you said?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
This is one way that we know that it's found throughout the observable universe
Mm-hmm.
because even black holes that are many, many light years away from us, we can detect waves that are emitted from them whenever they're formed. So, since these waves are traveling through the fabric of reality, we know that it's all connected in some fundamental way.
Hmm.
And the way that they create waves, I've shown a picture on the next slide, which surprisingly also has a lot of connections to fluid mechanics. So you can kind of, some physics models trying to model space-time, model it with fluid dynamics, and it actually works very well. So you can see this represents two neutron stars. And when two neutron stars come together, you can see they're apart right here. And then they start to come together a little bit. And then they really start to mix together. And then finally, they totally combine together into a black hole. And what's showing you at the bottom right here, these yellow and blue swirls, shows you that whenever they're coming together, there's gravitational waves being created. So there's vibrations and waves happening in the fabric of space-time, and that's what we can detect at places like LIGO in Louisiana. But once the black hole fully merges, then that's when these gravitational waves stop. And we have many of these LIGO observatories. I think we at least have two of them, so we can triangulate the system wherever the system is occurring. So we'll have two different detection centers on Earth, and we'll use those 2 points to triangulate the system and confirm that this black hole did form wherever it did in the universe. So we know that this gravitational wave did come from somewhere in the universe, like a black hole merger or a neutron star merger to create a black hole, where these waves could be made.
Hmm.
So this is just one way that we've shown that there is some informational fabric connecting all of reality, even the things far, far away.
And how often do neutron stars combine like that to make a black hole?
By training, I'm a pharmacologist,
Okay.
so I don't know, to be honest with you. I know it happens since the universe is extraordinarily large. I know that there is one, you know, that happens frequently enough for us to measure.
Mm-hmm.
However, exactly how often they occur,
Mm-hmm.
I really don't know. But
Gotcha.
they happen enough for us to have information from these LIGO observatories
Mm-hmm.
and to also make models like this from the data we've collected from these observatories.
Okay.
So they happen often enough for us to do real science on it and come up with new perspectives on how these things happen. So now this gives us a framework to think of gravity, and this is just a metaphor. I'm not trying to say that gravity is a quasi-particle. A quasi-particle is just a way to think of gravity. So what a quasi-particle is a collective vibration or oscillation in a group of atoms or particles. For instance, a vibration in a crystal. All the atoms in the crystal that are vibrating together can be thought of as a quasi-particle, because a particle is something that has the same vibration. So whenever you have a group of particles or a group of atoms all vibrating together and having the same vibration, it's called a quasi-particle. So since gravity also can behave in this way, since the fabric of space-time can also have a collective oscillation, which I've previously shown, you can kind of think of it as a quasi-particle. It's at least a good metaphor to understand the nature of the fabric of space and time. Any cares or concerns?
Hmm. In the example you gave earlier of like falling to Earth, you have gravity bringing you towards Earth. Does that create a quasi particle with the particles within your body? Or how does that work?
I don't really think it creates a quasi-particle with the particles in your body, but you can think as all the segments of information or all the coordinates in space-time and all the quantum fluctuations that are all bending in this similar geometry
Mm-hmm.
going to Earth and being bent towards Earth. I think since they're all following a similar geometry, you can think of that as kind of like a quasi-particle, since a quasi-particle is a vibration or a structure or geometry happening in all the atoms or particles. Gravity, the bent geometry that is gravity, that is the geometry of space-time, you can think of that as a quasi-particle.
Okay.
So that moves us to how gravitational waves and gravity itself reorganizes information through disparity at the most fundamental level, because as this new geometry emerges, whether it be planets or stars or gravitational waves from neutron stars merging or black holes merging, whatever it may be, when you have this changing of geometry in space-time, that also offers new ways for the underlying information of reality to reorganize, which allows for new emergent patterns. So this is just bringing home the point that gravity is the continuous emergence of new patterns from some underlying informational network or fabric or geometry.
Okay.
So then whenever you're thinking about space-time functioning this way, it also allows you to think of how time is relative. So Einstein proved over 100 years ago through the general theory of relativity that time isn't the same everywhere in the universe. Some places in the universe, time is slower or faster. And that hasn't only been proven by Einstein's theory of relativity, which was proved mathematically, but we've also measured it and we have to calibrate it for our GPS systems. So the satellites that coordinate our GPS locations, the satellites experience time a little bit faster, and we have to account for that difference in time in order to calculate the GPS coordinates on Earth. And the reason that they experience time a little bit faster is because they're experiencing a different place in the gravitational field. So whenever you have more constraints by the gravitational field, like on Earth or close to a black hole, time is going to move slower. So you can think about it as this geometry is changing and emerging a little bit slower. Where if you go out in space and you don't have any you're not being as constrained as much as you are close to a black hole or on a planet or close to a star. Whenever you're just out in empty space, time is moving a little faster because you're not being the geometry that accounts for your for time isn't being constrained as much. So you can basically think of time as the changing of these geometrical patterns. So that's why time is relative, because at certain parts in the universe, time might be happening faster or slower depending on the rate of change of this geometry.
Hmm.
Any cares or concerns?
How was Einstein able to come up with the idea of relative time?
So he was able to come up with it mainly through imagination. I mentioned this kind of earlier in the video that he imagined himself falling and falling in space. You don't really experience any force because you're falling with the direction of space. So that's where he came up with space time, which is the general theory of relativity. So he understood that space itself was woven into a fabric, and the way that that fabric is woven and the way that that fabric changes is what we experience as time. So he understood that space and time were really connected into a fabric.
Hmm.
And that was his theory of general relativity, which was about a little over 100 years ago, and it predicted gravitational waves, and it also predicted time dilation, which we use in GPS satellites. So moving on, you asked me earlier about the multiverse and universes that could exist outside our own and how they might be different. And one way you can think about how they might be different is that since even on a satellite, time can be moving at a different rate than on Earth, and that's just, we can kind of imagine that distance.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you imagine a universe that exists outside of the observable universe, then you could also imagine that the physical constraints might be different and time might be moving faster or slower due to those physical constraints, which will make a totally different universe than we can maybe even ever imagine outside of ours. So different regions of the geometry evolve at different rates. So there could be universes outside of ours that maybe emerged around the same time as ours. However, they're experiencing time at a way faster rate than we are. So maybe they have evolved a lot more faster than we have. So there could be drastically different realities that exist because time is not fundamental. You change it, and the rate of change of this geometry can either increase or decrease.
Hmm. And so the says flat region, moderate curvature, high curvature. That geometry, that's not necessarily land. That could also be space time and gravity, or
Yeah, that is representing
mm,
the space time.
yeah,
So
okay.
you would imagine high curvature would be created by a black hole or a star or Earth,
Mm,
and then moderate curvature would be just made by maybe dust clouds or something like that.
mm.
And then flat regions would just be in the vacuum of space.
Where are we on this? Are we considered moderate because we're on
Yeah, I
Earth?
think we would be the moderate.
Okay.
And just like I was trying to explain earlier, in empty space, you have the highest rate of change, and time is moving the fastest. You're having all
Mm,
these quantum fluctuations. On Earth, time is moving how we experience it. But then if you go close to a black hole, like on the movie Interstellar, then you're experiencing time at a much, much slower rate than you are on Earth or in empty space.
Hmm.
And that's all because the fabric of space-time determines time based off the rate of change. So all time is the rate of change of space or the emergence of geometrical patterns. So now that finally brings us to life, biomolecular condensates, which are made through liquid-liquid phase separation. So you have all of these different ways that information can organize using the same mechanism. And on Earth, they initially organized without membranes through biomolecular condensates, which are just little droplets of water that are organizing in a different phase because they're filled with biomolecules. And as membranes and other biomolecules, DNA, RNA, and proteins organize together, that will eventually create organelles and cells, which will keep on organizing together until you have the evolution of life on Earth. So it's the same organizing principle. It's still percolation, but it's happening on Earth through liquid-liquid phase separation to create life. So any cares or concerns for this slide?
Yeah, how would you? Reminds me of the brain, of course, with like all the cells working together. And I mean, does that like mirror the universe and how it operates? That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah, so it's the same organizing principles that are governing how all the information and different components are being organized together in different configurations. And you can think about, and a common metaphor that's used is that there's basically a universe inside the human brain or inside all of organisms because there's almost just as many molecules and atoms and particles inside a human body as there are solar systems or stars in the universe. So it's almost like the same amount of interactions happening inside our body as they are outside of our body in the observable universe. So, in that way, you can think about how all of the molecules inside of us can be organized together to imagine things outside of the universe because you almost have the same amount of components that can be played with in different configurations to make different representations. So that's why when you think about consciousness, a holographic perspective, a holographic framework is usually used because we can basically build a holographic map of molecules in our mind to represent things outside of us so that we can experience them.
Hmm.
So we're ready to move on. So that brings us perfectly to understanding everything in the universe in a fractal framework. So you have the information at the most fundamental scales, and that information can combine in different perspectives, which will create different geometrical patterns. Since it is the same information combining in different geometrical patterns using the same organizing principles, the same physical constraints, you end up with quantum fields which have fractal properties and have similar organizational principles at different scales of the field, which is what makes it fractal. Those particles are excitations on that field. As those particles combine together in that field, they create atoms. The atoms can create molecules. The molecules combine together to create macromolecules like proteins, RNA, and DNA, and other types of crystals and stuff like that. Those biological macromolecules can create biomolecular condensates, which come together and form organelles and cells. Those cells organize into organisms and societies and civilizations, and the same organizing principles exist in solar systems and galaxies and nebulas, which is where stars are born, and even in the cosmic web. So, this organizing principle of information that exists at all scales is what makes fractal organization observable at all these different scales, because you can have fractal organization in quantum fields, you can have fractal organization in liquid phase separation and in the fiber networks of the body. You can have fractal organization in the circulatory system and in the brain structure. You can have fractal organization in rivers and ecosystems. You can have fractal organization in galaxies and clusters of galaxies, and you can have it in the cosmic web. So it exists at all scales because of this similar organizational mechanism that makes things rhyme, so to speak, at every scale. Any cares or concerns?
So the lowest on the list you got, the lowest thing on there we could observe would be fields, right? There's no like way to visualize, observe the information in its binary state or
Yeah, there's no
no.
way to observe that yet. Possibly, maybe if we can really start to investigate the quantum fluctuations at the Planck scale, maybe we can make out exactly that informational substrate. However, right now we're stuck with our imagination
Hmm.
and with math.
Hmm.
So we can understand it from a mathematical perspective, and how, from a mathematical perspective, and computer science, how this fundamental information could lead to quantum fields and all the other scales of existence that we can observe.
Okay.
All right, and then that brings me to my most simplified figure that I think tries to explain how all of this is connected, the U loop and the scaling of consciousness. So basically, what I'm explaining with this perspective is that consciousness is the underlying organizational principle of information in the universe. And there's many different kinds of consciousness that is described and defined by the information that's being organized. However, it's the same organizing principle, which is perspective. So you can think of, there's many papers and articles being written about how an electron can even be described as having its own consciousness and its own perspective and its own memory from the past entangled states it has had. You can think of a mitochondria. A mitochondria has its own DNA. It's predicted that 2 billion years ago, it used to be an alpha proteobacteria, a purple bacteria that combined into archaea cells to produce a eukaryotic cell. And still to this day, our bacteria and all the cells of our, I mean, well, the what used to be bacteria, the mitochondria that exist in all the cells of our body, which used to be a bacterium, it has its own DNA. It is its own organism. It has its own perspective and its own information processing. However, it has no clue about our goals or what we want to do with our lives. But yet, its whole life and how it goes about passing on its DNA is vital to our lives, even though its perspective is not even really connected to our own. Therefore, our own perspective might not be the biggest conscious perspective in the universe. There may be bigger perspectives, bigger connections, bigger consciousness. Some people might think of that as a higher power that exists beyond us. And we could be the mitochondria that is totally unaware of the goals of this bigger perspective. So, does the U stand for the universe, or does the U stand for us? And us meaning all the consciousness that exists in reality. Cares and concerns.
Yeah, I can definitely see it being us. It makes me think of how over the generations, people transfer information and knowledge to each other, and from that we've built science and math and you name it.
Right, so it's
Mm.
all a combination of perspectives which continually creates new emergent technology that helps us connect and care about more and more people. So that is the ultimate goal. So, closing, we are not separate from the universe, we are expressions of it. We are how it learns, grows, and remembers through emergence and through relationships, which subsequently creates more emergent perspectives. So, this is just a slide to summarize everything we talked about, all the different scales, the fractal hierarchy, and how it's a simple pattern of information with limitless possibilities. And it all has to do with the relationships between all of these patterns and how new perspectives can emerge. Anything else on the closing?
Don't think there's anything I could add. I'm still getting the grasp of everything, so
All right.
yeah.
And my final slide, I wanted to put the book, The Cosmic Code, from Heinz Pagels. The book was about quantum physics as a language of nature. This is where I got my stereoscopic perspective from, and I connected it to a lot of things that I've done research on, like liquid phase separation. And at the end of his book, he has a paragraph about climbing mountains. He used to like going on hikes and mountaineering, which is, these are pictures from climbs that I've done and hikes that I've gone on myself. So I just wanted to put these here so I can relate to him. He died in 1988. And if you read the end of this book, it's very interesting how he almost predicted his demise. But the point of it was because he actually died mountain climbing. But I think the point of it was to don't be afraid to express yourself. Expressing your imagination is what the universe was intended to do, is the meaning of life, I think, is to combine with as many perspectives as possible and to try to create new perspectives as a result so that more people can be aware of how these new perspectives can help one another. So I think that's the point of life and why life emerged, and also the point of this video series. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe and have a good day. Any ending messages from Keegan? Cares
No,
or
I
concerns?
think you said it beautifully, honestly, and thank you for having me.
All right, and thank you for coming on, Keegan.
Yes, sir.
And everyone, have a wonderful day.